The rust never sleeps. That is the first thing you learn down here, beneath the billions of tons of rock and steel that make up the city. You think you know silence, but you don't. True silence doesn't exist in the hive. There is always the hum, the vibration of the ventilation fans that have been spinning since before my grandfather was born. The distant rhythmic thud of the great atmospheric pumps that sounds like the heartbeat of a dying god. And the scratching. The endless dry scratching of 10,000 auto-quills moving across vellum parchment recording numbers that no one will ever read. You would have done the same as me. You know you would. If you sat in that chair for 20 years, watching the dust settle on your knuckles waiting for a life that never comes, you would have looked at the anomaly. You would have pulled the thread. The archive of Sector 7G is not a room. It is a canyon. The ceiling is lost in a haze of incense smoke and suspended dust particles, illuminated by the sickly yellow glow of sodium vapor lumens. Some of the lights flicker a strobing spasm that induces migraines if you look up for too long. So we don't look up. We look down. We look at the ledgers. My desk was made of stamped metal cold to the touch, sharp at the edges, where the paint had worn away decades ago. It smelled of ozone and stale sweat. My designation is Kalen 79. Not a name, really. Just a label to differentiate me from Kalen 78, who died of a lung infection 3 months ago, and Kalen 80, who has not yet been assigned. I am a scribe of the administratum. I am a finger on the hand that counts the tithe. I am nothing. Time is a fluid concept when you never see the sun. We measure our lives in shifts and quotas in the recycling cycles of the air filtration units. I had been sitting at my station for 6 hours when the error appeared. My back was a knot of dull pain, a familiar companion that settled between my shoulder blades every morning and refused to leave. The air tasted metallic, recycled too many times, stripped of everything but the barest essential oxygen. I was processing grain distribution manifests from the agri-domes 3 levels above. It is mind-numbing work. Row after row of figures, tonnages, spoilage rates, nutritional density charts. My hand moved automatically the auto-quill, wired into my glove dancing across the page. Scritch, scratch, dip, scritch, scratch. It is a hypnosis. You stop thinking. You become the quill. Then the pattern broke. It was a small thing. A single digit in column 14, row 312. A discrepancy in the protein paste allocation for Hab block delta. The numbers didn't balance. According to the input log, 3,000 tons of starch meal had been delivered. According to the consumption log, only 2,000 tons had been distributed. 1,000 tons of food missing. In a city of billions where starvation is a method of population control, 1,000 tons is a rounding error. It is a speck of dust. But in the administratum, a rounding error is heresy. Accuracy is our prayer. Precision is our offering to the golden throne. I stared at the numbers. The yellow light reflected off the vellum, making the black ink look like dried blood. I should have corrected it. That is the protocol. If the numbers do not match, you assume a clerical error in the intake. You adjust the consumption to match the delivery. You smooth the surface of the data until it is flat and perfect again. You do not ask where the food went. You do not ask who is eating it, or if it was ever there at all. I reached for the eraser, a small block of pumice stone meant to scrape away the ink. My hand hovered. The fan above me rattled a jarring mechanical cough that broke the rhythm of the room. I looked at the number again. It wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate. The math was too clean in its wrongness. It was a perfect subtraction. The servo skull assigned to my aisle drifted past. It is a ghastly thing, a human skull stripped of flesh, fitted with anti-gravity motors, and optical sensors floating on the air currents. It hummed as it passed its singular red eye, scanning the tops of our heads, checking for idleness. I bent low over my ledger, heart hammering against my ribs. Why was I afraid? It was just a number. But fear is the currency of our lives. We fear the arbiters with their shock mauls. We fear the supervisors with their electro-whips. We fear the loss of our rations. Most of all, we fear being noticed. To be noticed is to be assessed, and to be assessed is to be found wanting. I waited for the skull to pass. The hum faded. I didn't use the pumice. I felt an itch, not on my skin, but deeper somewhere behind my eyes. A pressure building at the base of my skull. It was the curiosity, the fatal flaw. Why this block? Why this week the data slate in front of me was a window into a reality I was forbidden to see? I toggled the rune on the slate's brass casing, switching the view from the summary to the raw feed. The screen flickered green text scrolling rapidly. It was forbidden to access the raw feed without a supervisor's key, but the machine was old, and its machine spirit was senile. It let me in. I told myself I was just being thorough. I told myself I was doing my duty to the master of mankind by ensuring the purity of the record. I was lying. I was bored. I was desperate for something, anything to be different. The raw data showed a transfer. The missing food hadn't been eaten. It had been diverted, rerouted to a maintenance tunnel that officially didn't exist. Tunnel 44B. I traced the line with my finger, leaving a smudge of oil on the glass. The destination was listed simply as reclamation. My breath caught in my throat. Reclamation handles waste. Sewage? The dead. Why send high-grade protein paste to a sewage processing plant? The absurdity of it made me dizzy. Or perhaps it was the air. The ventilation system seemed to be struggling today. The air was thick, heavy, pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. I looked around the room. Thousands of heads bowed, thousands of hands writing. Did they know? Did anyone else see the cracks in the world? 79 focus. The voice was a whisper in my own head, but it sounded like my supervisor, Magos Vrend. He wasn't there, of course. He was up on the dais watching the productivity screens. But his voice was always with me. Don't ask, just record. Your life is the ink. Your soul is the paper. I tried to listen to him. I tried to close the raw feed, but my fingers wouldn't obey. They felt cold, numb, as if they belonged to a corpse. I copied the coordinates of Tunnel 44B onto a scrap of waste parchment. I slipped it into my sleeve. The friction of the rough paper against my wrist felt like a burn. It was the hottest thing I had felt in years. I looked at the number again. It seemed to shimmer under the sodium light. For a second, just a fraction of a second, the black ink seemed to bleed. It ran down the page, a dark tear in reality, before snapping back into shape. I blinked, dubbing my eyes. The headache spiked a sharp needle of pain behind my left temple. I gasped, dropping the quill. It clattered loudly on the metal desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the library. Heads turned. Eyes dark-rimmed and hollow stared at me from the neighboring desks. I froze. I waited for the alarms. I waited for the heavy boots of the enforcers. Nothing happened. The heads turned back. The scratching resumed. The ocean of bureaucracy swallowed my mistake without a ripple. I picked up the quill. My hand was shaking. I looked at the ledger at the lie I was supposed to sanctify. I dipped the pen in the inkwell. I didn't correct the number. I left the error. I left the gap. It was a tiny act of rebellion invisible to the universe, but it felt like I had just screamed in a cathedral. The static in the air grew louder, a white noise that wasn't sound, but sensation. It tasted like copper. It felt like ants crawling under my uniform. The shift whistle blew, a shrill mechanical shriek that signaled the end of the rotation. Around me, The other scribes stood up in unison, a wave of gray robes and hunched backs. I stood up with them. My legs were stiff, my joints popping. I walked towards the exit, towards the transport tubes that would take me to my sleeping cell. I could feel the scrap of paper in my sleeve. It pulsed against my skin, a second heartbeat. Tunnel 44B. The gray prison of the archive was behind me, but I carried its dust in my lungs. I walked into the corridor, joining the river of bodies. We marched in silence, a procession of ghosts. But for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't looking at the floor. I was looking at the shadows between the pipes. I was listening to the static. And the static was waiting for me. The silence stayed. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was holding its breath. My hab cell is a coffin made of concrete. It measures 2 meters by 1 meter. Just enough space to lie down, but not enough to stretch. If I extend my arms, my knuckles scrape the rough walls. It smells of recycled sweat and the nutrient paste we sweat out. Tonight the air was stifling. The ventilation fans had cycled down to night cycle conservation mode, which simply means we are allowed to suffocate slowly until morning. I lay on my bunk, the thin mattress offering no protection against the cold metal frame. The scrap of parchment in my sleeve burned. It was a physical heat radiating up my arm, pulsing in time with my heart. Tunnel 44B. The coordinates danced behind my eyelids. Sleep was impossible. To sleep was to accept the day that had passed and the identical day that would follow. I could not accept it. Not tonight. I waited until the rhythmic breathing of the other residents filled the block. It is a terrible sound. The collective wheezing of 10,000 lungs damaged by industrial smog. I slid off my bunk. My boots were already on. We never take them off. You never know when a hull breach or a gang raid might happen. Stepping into the corridor was an act of madness. Curfew is absolute. If a servitor catches you, you are flogged. If an arbiter catches you, you disappear. But the itch in my brain was louder than my fear. I moved through the shadows, hugging the walls. The lumens were dimmed to a dull copper glow, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to reach for my ankles. The city was sleeping, but it wasn't quiet. The pipes in the walls groaned and clanked, the digestive tract of a metal beast digesting its own waste. I descended. Down the maintenance ladders past the rusted gantries of the water reclamation levels, down into the underspine. The air grew hotter here, thick with moisture and the smell of ozone. This was the nervous system of the hive, where thick bundles of cables coiled like black serpents along the ceiling. The walls dripped with condensation that tasted of oil and copper. I checked the coordinates on the scrap of paper. I was close. I should have been terrified. I should have turned back. But as I walked deeper into the dark, I felt a strange sensation. My headache was gone. The pressure behind my eyes had vanished, replaced by a clarity I had never known. For the first time, I wasn't just a number. I was a ghost haunting the machine. I found the door. It wasn't marked. It was just a panel of corrugated plasteel welded shut years ago, covered in layers of grime and warning stickers that had faded to white. But the welding was fresh in one spot, a small, jagged hole just big enough to squeeze through. I pushed against it. The metal groaned, a sound of protest. I slipped inside. The smell hit me instantly, burnt wiring and something else, something organic. Musk, old blood, and cooking meat. Real meat, not the protein sludge we were fed. My stomach twisted in a knot of hunger and revulsion. I was in a service tunnel lit only by the spark of a loose power coupling hanging from the ceiling. "You're late, 79. The voice came from the shadows. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought they would crack. I knew that voice. It belonged to Joran 44. Joran, who had died in a machinery accident 6 months ago. We had all seen the report. We had all signed the condolences form. I turned slowly. A figure stepped into the flickering light of the sparks. It was him. But he was different. His administratum robes were tattered, stained with grease, and he had stripped the aquila from his chest. His eyes were wide, too wide, the pupils dilated until they were almost entirely black. He was smiling. "We don't smile in the administratum. It's a waste of energy," Jor and I whispered. You were crushed. The press stamp. I saw the log." He laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound like sandpaper on bone. "The log says what they want it to say, Kalen. Just like the food distribution. Just like the tithe." He stepped closer. He didn't look like a dead man. He looked alive. More alive than I had ever seen him. He smelled of that burnt ozone and sweat. But there was an intensity to him, a vibration. He reached out and touched my shoulder. His hand was hot. "Look," he said, pointing to the wall behind him. "Look at what they hide." I looked. The wall was covered in diagrams, scrawled in chalk and grease in something dark that looked like dried blood. Maps. Not of the hive I knew, but of the spaces between. The ventilation shafts, the forgotten elevators, the drainage systems. And in the center, a drawing of the spire, but inverted. A root system growing downwards. "The Emperor protects," Joren whispered, his breath hot on my ear. "But who feeds us? Who keeps the heat on? Not him. Us. The ones in the walls." He wasn't making sense. He was speaking heresy. I should have run. I should have reported him. But I didn't. Because as I looked at the chaotic map, I saw the logic in it. It was beautiful. It was free. Why, I asked. Why show me? Joren leaned back, his eyes gleaming in the dark. "Because you saw the number, Kalen. You didn't erase it. You saw the bleeding wound in the world, and you stuck your finger in it." He tapped the wall. It sounded hollow. "This wall is thinner than you think. The difference between order and chaos is just a sheet of plasteel." He reached into his rags and pulled out a small metallic object. A data spike. "Take it. Put it in your terminal. See what the raw feed really looks like." I hesitated. This was treason. This was death. But my hand moved on its own. I took the spike. It was cold and heavy. I left him there in the dark. I climbed back up the ladder, my lungs burning, my legs trembling. Not from exertion, but from adrenaline. I had broken the law. I had spoken to the dead. I had touched the heresy. And I was still alive. I slipped back into my hab cell just as the shift lights began to brighten, signaling the start of the morning cycle. I lay on my bunk, the data spike hidden in my boot. I looked at the ceiling. The crack in the concrete above my head looked like a mouth. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was electric. I closed my eyes, but I could still see Joren's map burning in the dark. The fear was gone. Only the hunger remained. 3 cycles later, I went back down. The data spike Joren gave me was still hidden in my boot, a cold lump against my ankle bone, but I hadn't used it yet. I wasn't ready to see the code. I wanted to see the people. I followed the marks Joren had scratched into the walls, descending past the reclamation levels, past the filtration grids, down to where the air stopped moving. The temperature rose with every ladder I climbed down. In the upper habs, we freeze. The cold is a constant biting reminder of our insignificance. But here, deep in the bowels of the city's plumbing, it was warm. A wet, suffocating heat that clung to my skin like a second layer of clothing. The air tasted of fermentation, sweet rot, old water. It was the smell of a grave that had been left open in the sun. The destination was a decommissioned cistern, a vast circular chamber where the sewage of the upper spires used to collect. It had been dry for decades, the floor covered in a thick layer of silty sludge. I stood in the shadow of a rusted intake pipe looking out. I expected to find a war council. I expected weapons maps, anger. I expected to see the face of rebellion. Instead, I saw a hospice. There were dozens of them, men and women huddled together on the damp ground. Some were administratum, Like me, their robes stained and torn. Others were laborers, their bodies twisted by years of heavy lifting. They sat in small circles, illuminated by the bioluminescent glow of moss that grew on the damp walls. They were sharing food, not rations, not the gray starch bricks we were issued. Real meat. I stepped into the light. The mud sucked at my boots with a wet, slurping sound. No one raised a weapon. No one shouted. A few heads turned, eyes glinting in the gloom. They didn't look at me with suspicion. They looked at me with recognition, as if they had been waiting for me. My left hand began to itch. It started in the center of my palm, a deep, burrowing tickle right next to the bone. I scratched it absent-mindedly, digging my fingernails into the callus. The sensation was sharp, bordering on pain, but it brought a strange relief. It was a focal point, a place where I ended and the world began. A man approached me. He was tall, gaunt, his torso bare. His skin was a tapestry of scars and lesions, weeping fluids that glistened in the low light. By the standards of the Imperium, he was unclean. He should have been in a quarantine incinerator. But he walked with a grace that unnerved me. He held out a tin bowl. "Eat," he said. His voice was soft, melodic, devoid of the grinding fatigue that infected everyone else I knew. The city throws us away, brother. They call us waste. But they forget what waste becomes. He smiled, and his teeth were yellow, but his eyes were bright. We are not trash. We are fertilizer. We are the soil for the new garden. I took the bowl. The meat was unrecognizable, swimming in a dark broth. I ate. It tasted of iron and salt. It tasted of life. Around me, the congregation began to make a sound. It wasn't a chant, not yet. It was a low collective hum, a vibration that started in their chests and resonated against the curved walls of the cistern. It was the sound of pain being shared until it wasn't pain anymore. It was a harmony of suffering. I sat down in the mud. The warmth of the room seeped into my bones. For 20 years I had been cold. For 20 years I had been alone in a room full of people. Now, surrounded by the sick and the dying, I felt a terrifying sense of peace. I looked at my hand again. I had scratched the palm until it was raw. A small bead of blood welled up dark and thick. It didn't hurt. It felt open. The man with the lesions sat beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. His touch was fever hot. He didn't ask for my name. He didn't ask for my rank. He just hummed, adding his voice to the drone of the room. I listened to the water dripping from the ceiling. Drip, drip, drip. It was a metronome counting down to something. I looked at the woman across from me. She had a hole in her cheek, the flesh eaten away by some industrial caustic. She caught my eye. She didn't look away in shame. She smiled. It wasn't mercy. It was an invitation. Her wound wasn't healing, but she was happy. And that scared me more than the dark. The lights were screaming. That is the only way to describe it. Before, the sodium vapor lamps were just a dull, yellow oppression. Now they were needles pushed into my optic nerves. I sat at my desk, the same desk I had occupied for 2 decades. But the dimensions felt wrong. The metal surface seemed too flat, too perfect. It was artificial. A lie constructed to keep us calm. I looked at the scribe next to me, a boy named Kalen 80, who had replaced the dead man. He was hunched over his nose, inches from the parchment, drooling slightly as he wrote. He was a machine made of meat, a sheep chewing on numbers. I felt a sudden violent surge of contempt. I used to pity them. Now, looking at the curve of his exposed neck, I just felt disgust. They were asleep. I was the only one awake in a morgue. I had the pamphlet hidden under my official ledger. It was a crude thing printed on recycled waste paper that felt greasy to the touch. I had taken it from the cistern, slipped into my robes by the man with the weeping sores. It didn't look like much. just a collection of geometric shapes, 8-pointed stars, fractals, impossible angles that seemed to fold in on themselves. But as I stared at it, the headache returned. Not the dull throb of fatigue, but a sharp, clarifying spike of pain behind my eyes. I picked up my autoquill. The sound of it scratching against the vellum was no longer a rhythm. It was a shriek, scritch, scratch. Like a razor blade being dragged across a mirror, I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to focus on the geometry. The symbols were a code. I realized it not with my mind, but with my gut. The Administratum teaches us that the universe is a grid, vertical and horizontal, tithe and quota, life and death. But these shapes, they laughed at the grid. They suggested that the lines could be bent, that the walls of the cage were not solid. I began to trace the lines with the tip of my dry quill. "They see ink," I whispered the words, lost in the roar of the ventilation fans. "I see a map." The patterns weren't random. They were instructions. Not for a machine, but for the mind. They told me that pain was just information. They told me that the hunger I felt wasn't for food, but for reality. I looked up at the dais, where Magos Vrend stood monitoring the productivity screens. He looked small, insignificant, a spider sitting in a web he didn't understand. Tratu is a cage, I thought. Order is a cage. The thought was so loud I was afraid he heard it. The symbols on the paper began to vibrate. At first I thought it was the tremors from the heavy rail line passing 10 levels down. But the table wasn't shaking. The ink was. The black lines were unspooling, writhing like dying worms, rearranging themselves into new patterns. A star became an eye. A square became a mouth. I blinked, rubbing my eyes until I saw stars. When I looked back, the paper was still. Just grease and cheap ink. But the image was burned into my retinas. The noise of the office, the shuffling feet, the coughing, the scratching distorted into a low, guttural growl. It sounded like a beast breathing down my neck. I didn't recoil. I leaned into it. The world was ugly, yes. But for the first time it was interesting. The light was blinding, but I didn't close my eyes. I wanted to see what else was hiding in the glare. He hit me with the back of his gauntlet. It wasn't a correctional strike. It was personal. Overseer Krell didn't like the way I looked at the data slate. He said I was slow. He said I was wasting the Emperor's time. I tasted copper in my mouth. A loose tooth wiggled against my tongue, a new landscape in the geography of my jaw. I didn't look down. I looked at the rivets on his collar. I observed the sweat staining his uniform under the armpits. He was panting. Exertion makes them weak. He took off his respirator mask, a heavy brass unit that filtered the archival dust, and set it on the table to wipe his brow. That was his mistake. He thought he was the predator because he held the whip. He didn't know that the prey had stopped running. The camera in Sector 4 rotates every 30 seconds. There is a blind spot, a 3-second window of absolute privacy. I had timed it for years, just a way to pass the boredom. Now it was a weapon. I had a small ceramic shard in my pocket, debris from a broken fuse I had found in the corridor. It was sharp, jagged, and useless. Perfect. I didn't tremble. My hands, which used to shake when I spilt ink, were steady as stone. I watched the red eye of the lens swivel away. I reached out. The movement was fluid, practiced in my mind 1,000 times. I dropped the shard into the intake valve of his respirator. It made a tiny click as it settled into the fan mechanism. Krell didn't hear it. He was too busy lecturing me about duty, about the sanctity of the record. He put the mask back on. I watched. I waited. He took a breath. The intake fan spun up. Whir, click, crunch. The ceramic shard shattered inside the mechanism, jamming the rotors. The airflow stopped instantly. Krell's eyes went wide. He gasped, sucking in nothing but his own recycled carbon dioxide and the acrid smoke of the burning motor. He clawed at the straps. His face turned a deep, mottled purple. He fell to his knees, his fingernails scraping against the metal floor. It sounded like the auto quills. Scritch, scratch. I didn't help him. I stood there, hands clasped behind my back, watching the light fade from his eyes. My heart was beating fast, a drum solo in my chest. But it wasn't fear. It was exhilaration. It was the feeling of godhood. The itching on my palm stopped. The constant burrowing irritation that had plagued me for days simply vanished, replaced by a cool, soothing numbness. It felt like cold water on a burn. Krell stopped moving. He lay in a heap, a pile of black cloth and brass. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was full. I looked at his body. It didn't look like a man anymore. It looked like a broken cog removed from a machine. I stepped over him to get back to my desk. I sat down. I dipped my pen. He needed to be purified, I whispered to the empty room. A small price for quiet. The heat was not external. It didn't come from the ventilation shafts or the machinery. It bloomed from the marrow of my bones, a black sun rising inside my ribcage. I lay on my bunk, shivering so violently, my teeth clattered together like dice in a cup. They call it the corpse starch fever. Usually it kills you in 3 days. You cough up your lungs in bloody chunks, and then you die. But this was different. This wasn't a sickness. It was an invasion. The gray concrete of my ceiling began to soften. It dripped. Thick, viscous globs of stone hung like stalactites, swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. And the smell. It wasn't the ozone and sweat of the hive anymore. It was flowers. Lilies. Roses. But they were old. They were brown and collapsing, their petals turning to slime. It was a sweet, cloying scent that coated the back of my throat like syrup. I closed my eyes, but the darkness was full of light. Neon purples and sickly greens swirled behind my eyelids, forming shapes that had too many angles. I heard them then. Not the singular voice of Joran, but a chorus. 1,000 whispers layering over each other like insects crawling over dry leaves. They weren't threatening. They were solicitous, like a doctor speaking to a patient. Poor thing, they hissed. So rigid, so brittle. You will break if you do not bend. I tried to speak, to recite the litany of protection, but my tongue felt too big for my mouth. It tasted of fuzzy mold. Go away, I tried to say, but the words came out as a whimper. Why, the voices laughed. We are the medicine. The room dissolved. My bunk was no longer a metal frame. It was a bed of soft, wet moss. I looked at my arm. The skin was bubbling, not burning but boiling gently. Small, translucent blisters rose and fell like a simmering stew. Inside each blister, I saw a tiny, moving eye. They were looking at me. All of them. Watching my soul. I should have screamed. I should have clawed my skin off to get them out. But I didn't. I watched them with a detached fascination. The pain was there. A searing, white-hot agony, but it felt distant. It felt like it was happening to someone else. Or perhaps it felt like the pain of a seed, splitting open to let the sprout out. Don't heal me, I whispered into the humid dark. The words surprised me. Make me complete. The voices surged a crescendo of approval. The moss grew up around my limbs, holding me down, embracing me. I felt a finger, long, cold, and wet, trace the line of my jaw. Yes, the voice said. Perfection is not stasis. Perfection is change. The blisters on my arm popped, releasing not pus, but a fine golden dust that sparkled in the air. I breathed it in. It choked me, and it filled me. I woke up. The ceiling was concrete again. The moss was gone. I was soaked in cold sweat, my uniform clinging to me like a shroud. The fever was gone. but the smell of rotting flowers lingered in the corner of the room, faint and impossible. I looked at my arm. The skin was smooth, pale, unbroken. But when I pressed my thumb against the flesh, it felt different underneath. Softer, malleable, like dough waiting to be baked. The fever didn't break. It settled. It moved into the house and locked the door. The eyes were everywhere. Before, they were just glass lenses, part of the architecture, like the rivets and the rust. Now they were alive. I could feel them sliding over my skin like wet slugs. Every servitor that lumbered past half man and half loader crane seemed to pause just a fraction of a second too long. Their lobotomized stares weren't empty anymore. They were accusing. I sat at my station, and the hair on my arms stood up. The air felt charged, static electricity building before a storm. I tried to write, but my hand cramped. The numbers on the page looked like coordinates for a bombardment. "They know," the voice whispered. It wasn't the voice from the fever dream. It was my own voice, but it sounded tiny and terrified. "They know what you did to Krell. They know about the tunnel. They know what you are becoming. I left the archive early. I told the sub-overseer I was ill." He didn't look up from his slate. He just waved a dismissive hand. Was that a trap? Was he letting me go so they could track me? I walked into the corridor, moving fast. Too fast. I forced myself to slow down to match the trudging pace of the shift workers. But my heart was a piston engine hammering against my ribs. Thump, 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 thump. It was so loud I was sure the person walking next to me could hear it. I pulled my hood up. The shadows stretched out, reaching for my ankles. The ventilation grates looked like mouths waiting to scream. Then I heard it. The buzzing. High-pitched mosquito whine. A servo skull. It was hovering 10 meters behind me, drifting on its anti-grav motor. I turned a corner. It followed. I stopped to tie a bootlace that wasn't untied. It stopped. It hovered there, bobbing slightly in the air. Currents, its single red ocular lens cycling through zoom factors. Whir click. Whir click. It was scanning my thermal signature. It was reading my guilt. It wasn't a random patrol. It was a hunter. I couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in the ceiling, lowering to crush me. I was a rat in a maze, and the maze was shrinking. I lured it. I ducked into a blind alcove, a niche, where a statue of a saint had once stood, now just a jagged plinth. I pressed my back against the cold stone, holding my breath. The buzzing got louder. Closer. It sounded like a dentist's drill. The skull drifted around the corner, blind to my position for a split second. I didn't think. Instinct took the wheel. I swung my heavy satchel filled with metal styluses and data slates. It connected with a wet crunch. The skull smashed against the wall. Bone shattered. Circuits sparked. The anti-grav motor whined and died. It fell to the floor, a broken toy made of human remains. I stood over it, panting. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a terrible electric rage. I stomped on it. I crushed the lens under my boot until it was just red glass, dust, and wire. "Stop looking at me," I hissed. "Stop looking!" I kicked the pieces into the drainage gutter. The buzzing was gone. But the silence that replaced it was worse. It was heavy with implication. I looked up at the ceiling, at the other cameras, at the darkness. Had they seen? Or was I fighting ghosts? I wiped the bone dust from my boot. I didn't know if I was being hunted or if I was the one haunting myself. It didn't matter. The war had started. The cistern had changed. It was no longer a place of refuge. It was a cathedral of awful. The damp walls, once merely slick with condensation, were now daubed with symbols that hurt the eye. 8-pointed stars drawn in rust, in excrement, in dried blood. They weren't just drawings. They were windows. If you looked at the center of the stars for too long, you could see movement. A swirling gray mist, that had nothing to do with the atmosphere of the hive. The air was thick enough to chew. It tasted of copper and ozone, a metallic tang that coated my tongue. The congregation was there, but the silence of the hospice was gone. They were chanting, a low rhythmic drone that didn't sound like low Gothic. It sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. I walked to the center. The mud sucked at my boots, pulling me down, welcoming me. In the middle of the room, the man with the sores stood waiting. He was naked now, his body a map of lesions and scars that seemed to glow with an inner sickly light. He held a knife. It was a jagged piece of scrap metal sharpened on concrete, wrapped in dirty rags. He didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like a conduit, a wire stripped of insulation carrying too much current. The line of believers moved forward one by one. They didn't walk with the shuffling gait of the oppressed. They walked with the stride of kings. When it was my turn, the chanting stopped. The sudden silence was violent. It pressed against my eardrums a physical weight. The man held out the knife. His eyes were holes burned into a sheet of paper. "Open the door, Kalen," he whispered. "The key is inside you." I looked at the blade. It was filthy. Infection was a certainty. But fear was a distant memory, a concept I had left upstairs in the archives. I took the knife. It was warm from the hands of the others. It vibrated against my skin. I looked at my left palm, the one that had itched for weeks. The skin there seemed thin, translucent, barely holding back the pressure underneath. I didn't hesitate. I drew the blade across my palm. The skin parted with a wet, tearing sound. Pain flared wide and hot, but I pushed it down. I fed it to the hunger in my mind. Blood welled up. It was dark. Too dark. It didn't look like the thin, watery fluid of a malnourished scribe. It was thick, black, and heavy like crude oil. It dripped from my hand, splashing onto the metal grate at my feet. Drip. Drip. Each drop hit the floor with the force of a hammer strike. I watched it flow. It didn't pool. It moved. It slithered across the metal, seeking the grooves of the 8-pointed star etched into the floor. "Blood for the gods." I murmured the words, tasting like ash. Then I shook my head. No, that was their lie. Blood for freedom. The liquid connected the lines of the star. The circuit was complete. The air in the room ripped open. It wasn't a sound. It was a change in pressure that popped my ears. The shadows in the corners of the room detached themselves. They grew taller. They grew teeth. Something stepped out of the dark. It didn't have a face, only a hunger. And I didn't scream. I fell to my knees and wept. Because for the first time in my life, I was looking at something that didn't judge me. It just wanted to eat. And I was ready to be the meal. I went back to work. It seems absurd now, doesn't it? After you have seen the skin of the universe peel back, after you have fed your own blood to a shadow that has no name, you still wake up when the shift whistle blows. You still put on your boots. You still march in the line. But the world had lost its solidity. It was like walking through a painting that hadn't dried yet. The colors were running. The edges of the corridor blurred and smeared as I passed. My hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from my bedding, a tight knot of pressure against the fresh wound. It throbbed a steady drumbeat that was the only real thing in a world of ghosts. The taste of iron was strong in my mouth. It coated my tongue, thick and metallic, as if I had been chewing on the bars of a cage. It wasn't unpleasant. It tasted like strength. I sat at my desk. The archive was silent save for the scratching. But I didn't hear quills anymore. I heard knives. Thousands of tiny knives slicing into dried skin. I looked at the ledger in front of me. The vellum wasn't paper. I could see the pores. I could see the faint network of capillaries that had once held blood. It was skin. We were writing on the flayed skin of the dead, recording the debts of the living. I touched the page. It felt warm. It felt like it was pulsating. I looked at the inkwell. It wasn't black fluid, it was bile, thick, viscous, and shining with a sickly iridescence. I dipped my pen. The nib didn't scratch. It cut. I wasn't writing numbers. I was carving scars. I looked at Kalen 80, the boy next to me. He wasn't a scribe. He was a sack of wet organs held together by cheap gray cloth. His skin was translucent, like parchment held up to a candle. I could see the blue veins pumping sludge through his neck. I could see the gray spongiform mass of his brain pulsing inside his skull, shrinking with every number he memorized. He looked delicious. Not in a hunger way, but in the way a ripe fruit looks before it bursts. He turned to me, his eyes glassy and vacant. "Are you unwell, 79?" he asked. His voice was a wet gurgle. Bubbles of blood frothed at the corners of his mouth. He didn't know he was dead. None of them did. They were all corpses, propped up at desks, mimicking the actions of life. I started to laugh. It wasn't a decision. It was a reflex, like vomiting. It started low in my stomach, a bubbling pressure that fought its way up my throat. I tried to clamp my hand over my mouth, but the bandage was slippery with fresh seepage. The laugh escaped. It was a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the recycled air. Heads turned. 100 pairs of dead eyes swiveled toward me. The silence of the room shattered. But I couldn't stop. I looked at the overseer on the dais. He wasn't a man. He was a construct of rusting gears and rotting meat, his jaw unhinged, hanging by a thread of sinew. It was hilarious. It was the funniest joke I had ever seen. The emperor on his throne, the high lords, the tithe. It was all just a play performed for maggots. "Why don't you see I choked out standing up?" My chair clattered backward, a thunderclap in the tomb. "Look at it. It's beautiful." I gestured to the walls, which were breathing. I pointed to the ceiling, which was dripping with black ichor. "We aren't scribes. We are the butchers." Kalen 80 shrank back, fear rippling through his gelatinous face. The overseer was shouting now, his voice a distorted screech of static, but it sounded like music. I looked at my hands. The bandage had unraveled. The cut on my palm wasn't a wound. It was a mouth. And it was smiling. Then the sirens started. Not the shift whistle, the intrusion alarms. The red lights began to spin, bathing the room in the color of the blood I had spilled. The doors at the far end of the hall slammed open. I saw the armored silhouettes of the arbiters. They looked like beetles, hard and shiny and hollow. I didn't run. There was nowhere to run to. The walls were flesh, and I was just a cancer cell waiting to be cut out. I stood still amidst the chaos. The joke was over. The punchline had arrived. The sanctuary was burning. The damp moss that lined the walls of the cistern didn't catch fire, but the bodies did. Promethium is a hateful substance. It clings to skin and eats until there is nothing left but carbon and regret. I was running before I knew I was moving. The air was thick with gray smoke and the wet, gurgling screams of the faithful. But over it all, there was the sound. Crack Thum. Crack Thum. The bolters. They call it the Emperor's voice. It doesn't sound like a voice. It sounds like a heavy hammer striking wet clay. I saw the man with the weeping sores, my guide, my priest, disintegrate. 1 second, he was chanting, his arms raised to the smog-choked ceiling. The next, his upper torso was a red mist. There was no dignity in it, no final sermon to the masses, just wet physics and the smell of ozone. I scrambled over the pipes, slipping on the slime and the fresh blood of people I had shared bread with. The arbiters were black silhouettes against the orange firelight walls of ceramite, moving with terrifying mechanical synchronization. They didn't run. They advanced. Step. Fire. Step. Fire. I was a rat in a flooding sewer scurrying over the wreckage of my own salvation. I felt the impact before I heard the shot. It wasn't a bolter round. That would have vaporized me. It was a beam, a lance of coherent light that took me in the shoulder, spinning me around and slamming me against a rusted valve wheel. I slid to the ground, gasping, waiting for the agony. I waited for the cold seep of shock that precedes death. But it didn't come. I looked down at my shoulder. The fabric of my administratum robe was burned away, the edges glowing like embers. The flesh underneath was gone, scooped out by the heat. But there was no blood, no red fountain marking the end of my life. Instead, the wound was bubbling. A thick, viscous black foam rose from the meat, sizzling like acid on metal. It smelled of sulfur and fermentation. I touched it with a trembling finger. It didn't hurt. It felt numb like dead wood. The foam was hardening rapidly, knitting the flesh back together into a dark, chitinous scab. My body wasn't failing. It was reacting. It was sealing the breach. "Imperial dogs," I screamed. I don't know where the words came from. They tore out of my throat, ragged and bloody, a sound that belonged to a beast, not a scribe. You cannot kill the truth. You can burn the paper, but you cannot burn the ink. An arbiter turned toward me, his helmet a blank, eyeless mask of judgment. He raised his weapon. I didn't wait for the debate. I threw myself into the open drainage sluice behind me. It was a vertical drop into the unknown pitch, black and smelling of chemical waste and ancient rot. It was a suicide jump, or it should have been. I tumbled into the void. I struck metal, stone, and pipe. Bones should have snapped. My spine should have shattered like glass. But I just bounced. My body felt rubbery fluid absorbing the impacts with a sickening squelch. I was changing. I could feel the bones in my chest shifting, sliding over each other like tectonic plates to protect my hearts. Yes, hearts. I felt a second rhythm beating in my stomach. I rolled to a stop in the deep dark. The sounds of the purge, the screams, the explosions were distant, now muffled by tons of rock and waste. I lay there in the muck. I was broken, surely. But when I tried to stand, my legs obeyed. They felt stronger. Wrong, twisted, but stronger. I looked back up the shaft. A single beam of searchlight cut the gloom far above hunting. It didn't find me. I turned away from the light. I walked deeper. Into the intestine of the world. The darkness wasn't empty. It was waiting for me. I stopped walking when the floor turned to glass. Not the smooth, cool glass of a cathedral window, but jagged, fused obsidian, slick, with a glowing radioactive slime. I was miles deep now. The air here didn't move. It sat heavy in the lungs, hot and wet, tasting of sulfur and old isotopes. This was the stomach of the hive where the poisons that would kill a city were allowed to pool and fester. I fell to my knees. The impact didn't hurt. Nothing hurt anymore in the way I remembered. Pain was a language I used to speak, but I was learning a new dialect. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, vibrating with an energy that felt like a trapped bird, beating its wings against a cage. The skin on my knuckles was splitting, not from injury, but from pressure. Something was pushing from the inside. It started in the spine. A sudden wet snap that echoed in the silent cavern like a gunshot. I gasped, arching my back, expecting paralysis. Instead, I felt a rush of heat. My vertebrae were unlocking, sliding apart, lengthening. It was the feeling of a cramp, releasing, multiplied by 1,000. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It was a guttural, wet sound that bubbled up through a throat that was changing shape. My ribs groaned, a deep, grinding friction of bone against bone as they expanded. They were cracking, splintering, and knitting themselves back together in a wider, stronger cage. I tore at my tunic. The fabric shredded like wet paper. I needed room. The flesh on my chest was rippling, shifting like water under a storm. It hurts. I wheezed, my voice sounding like two stones rubbing together. But the thought was distant. A memory of a man who used to be afraid of paper cuts. No, no, this isn't pain. I clawed at the ground, my fingernails scraping sparks from the obsidian. This is capacity. A bulge formed on my shoulder right where the last burn had cauterized the skin. It pulsed. Thump. Thump. Faster than my heart. The skin stretched, turning translucent and shiny, tight as a drum. Then it tore. A spray of black ichor coated the rocks. From the wound, an eye opened. It was yellow reptilian, and it saw the dark with a clarity my human eyes never possessed. It looked at me. I looked at it. We were both Kalen. We were both the vessel. I rolled onto my back, thrashing in the sludge. My legs kicked out the joints, popping and reversing. My knees bent backward with a sickening crunch that felt like ecstasy. The hunger I had felt for weeks, the starvation of the soul, was finally being fed. The warp was pouring into me, filling the hollow spaces where my fear used to live. I felt a pressure in my forehead. A horn. A crown. It pushed through the skull a grinding bore that should have killed me. I screamed, but the scream shifted halfway through. It deepened. It became a roar. It was the sound of an engine starting up after 1,000 years of rust. I lay still. The violent thrashing stopped. The only sound was the wet dripping of fluids and the harsh, ragged panting of my new lungs. I breathed in the poison air. It was sweet. It was ambrosia. I flexed my hand. The fingers were longer, now tipped with black, chitinous talons. I touched my face. The features were shifting soft wax, melting under a flame. My nose was gone, replaced by slits. My jaw felt heavy, powerful, lined with rows of serrated bone. I tried to remember the face of the man who worked in the archives, the man who worried about ink stains. He seemed so small, so far away, like a dream I had once had. Kalen, I tried to say. The word felt wrong in my mouth. It was a square peg in a round hole. It was a name for a slave. I spat it out into the dark. I stood up. I was taller, heavier. The shadows of the cavern didn't hide me anymore. They draped around me like a cloak of velvet. I was not a victim of the dark. I was its prince. The pain was gone. Only the power remained. The light is painful now. It burns the new eyes. I stay in the shadows where the air is cool and tastes of rust. I can hear them coming. Not the ones who burned the sanctuary. Those are gone, eaten, or fled. These are new. Fresh meat wrapped in hard shells. Their boots make a thunderous noise on the stone. Clank, clank, clank. They are so loud. They do not know how to be part of the silence. I crouch on a gantry high above them. My limbs are folded tight, sharp angles of bone and muscle. I am heavy, but I make no sound. The metal does not creak under me. The metal knows me. It accepts me. I smell them before I see them. They smell of fear. It is a sharp, acidic scent like vinegar. They also smell of oil, of unwashed bodies, of prayers mumbled into microphones. Sector clear, one of them says. His voice is tinny, filtered through a voxcaster. No sign of the target. I tilt my head. Target Kalen was a target. Kalen was a soft thing that worried about numbers and ink. I am not Kalen. Kalen is dead. He died in the fire. He died in the drop. I am the echo. I am the thing that hatches from the egg when the shell breaks. I drop. I do not fall. I descend. Gravity is a suggestion I choose to obey. I land behind the straggler. He does not hear me. I am a shadow that has detached itself from the wall. I reach out. My hand, the claw, the talon closes around his helmet. I do not squeeze hard. I do not need to. The ceramite buckles like wet cardboard. He tries to scream, but the sound is cut off as I lift him. He is light. A doll filled with juice. I look into his lenses. I see my reflection. A kaleidoscope of eyes. A maw of teeth. A beautiful, perfect ruin. I do not hate him. I love him. He is nourishment. He is a sacrifice to the song that never ends. The others turn. Their weapons flare. Last fire cuts the dark, searing lines of red heat. They hit me. The beams burn against my hide, blackening the scales, but the pain is distant. It is just information. Heat. Impact. Resistance. I move through it. I am not fast. I am inevitable. I swipe, and a man is broken. I bite, and a life is extinguished. There is no malice. A storm does not hate the house it destroys. An earthquake does not hate the ground it splits. I am simply the correction of an error. The error of order. The error of their breathing. It is over quickly. The tunnel is quiet again. The only sound is the wet tearing of meat and the slow, heavy beat of my hearts. I stand over the wreckage. I feel full, for a moment. But the hunger is already returning. It is a void that cannot be filled. It is the itch that never stops the scratch that became a gouge. I look down at the data slate one of them dropped. It flickers in the gloom. I see a name on the manifest. Kalen 79. Status: heretic terminated. I look at the letters. They are just shapes, meaningless scratches on a screen. I crush the slate under my hoof. The glass turns to dust. I turn back to the deep dark, to the tunnels that go down forever, where the heat of the planet's core warms the stone. There are more of them coming. I can hear the distant hum of the elevators. I can smell the fresh fear drifting down the shafts. Good. The service continues. The work is never done. I cleaned the blood from my claws. There was nothing else to do.